Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the February Child Outcomes Accountability Team. Thank you for being with us this morning. We have about 18 folks in attendance right now. I do anticipate having a slightly larger group today because we did open the meeting even further for the public to hear more about the early childhood systems analysis, or Vermont's Child Care and Early Childhood Education Systems Analysis. But today's meeting is really exciting. It will be one of many opportunities over the next couple of months to hear from our national consultants on the systems analysis. So what I want to do to start is have everybody introduce themselves in the chat, both your name and your role, and if you are a formal member of the Child Outcomes Accountability Team. So just at the end, if you can write COAT at the end of your introduction. I'm Morgan Crossman. I'm the Executive Director of Building Bright Futures, and I'm here today with Anna Brulette, who is our Policy Director. So just in terms of today's agenda, again, we'll do these introductions. You'll hear from our contractors on the systems analysis, and we'll talk a little bit about upcoming meetings and what's coming next. If you want to advance to the next slide, Anna. Just as a reminder to this team, I know that you've consistently been with us, but the Child Outcomes Accountability Team is monitoring Goal 1 of Vermont's Early Childhood Action Plan, which serves as our strategic plan for kids and families. And this goal is to improve integration and coordination of the early childhood public and private partners who are really committed to the health and well-being of children and families, which ultimately is almost everyone in Vermont's early childhood system, but we do have a really core, tight-knit team of folks who are here today to tackle this issue. And so this group comes together almost monthly, but at least 6 to 8 times a year to inform the strategies and monitor progress to ensure that all kids are healthy, and that we are monitoring outcomes for the prenatal period to 3rd grade, specifically as we think about domains of physical health, child development, education outcomes, mental health outcomes, and outcomes related to basic needs. This group is also charged in several different ways as the primary advisory body or the primary steering committee for some of our federal grants. So specifically the Early Childhood Comprehensive Systems Grant funded by HRSA, where we're really talking about the importance of prevention, early identification, and aligning maternal and child health and early childhood systems. And that is both true for the HRSA grant, but also the ACT Early grant funded by the Association of University Centers on Disability, or AUCD. So just quickly wanting to remind folks that because we're talking about systems integration and how we develop a strong system for kids and families, today's discussion is really going to be about governance and administration of this early childhood system and how we are moving forward in this domain to best meet the needs of kids and families. So what you will hear from our contractors is the current status of what they've heard from all of our stakeholders, or the stakeholders that have currently been participating in interviews or focus groups, and an opportunity to provide feedback. So I'm going to hand it over to Elliot to give you that overview now.
Thank you. And thanks, Morgan, and great to see some familiar names in the group, but also some new folks, and really glad to have this opportunity to share our findings so far with you. I am going to attempt to share my screen, and hopefully you can now see my slide, the cover slide. So if for some reason you can't, let me know, but I will try to move through this relatively quickly because I want to make sure we have plenty of time for discussion. So just to give a brief overview of what we're going to do today, I'm going to start by talking about sort of the introducing what we're doing and talking about our methodology. I'm going to go through some of the major themes of what we've heard, and then share some concluding thoughts on behalf of myself and Nasha Patel from Watershed Advisors, who unfortunately wasn't able to join this morning. We are then going to open it up for discussion, and I welcome any questions and feedback, but the major question that I would ask all of you is to tell us what does and does not resonate from the report. Also, just want to flag that while having a group conversation can be really valuable in that it gets different people's ideas bouncing off of each other, it also is limited in that there are certain things people may feel more comfortable saying individually. So I certainly hope that if you have thoughts that you want to share but don't feel comfortable sharing in a full group, that you reach out to us separately, and we're happy to hear it. Okay, so to start with sort of what this is and how we've done it. The systems analysis, as probably many of you know, is happening because there was a sense among at least some Vermont stakeholders that in order to best serve children and families, when you're talking about young children birth to 5, that the state was not organized as well as it could be to serve that population. The state doesn't serve those children directly, but it does create important context for community levels, for community level leaders, for providers. And so that important state role, the question of how can the state play it most effectively? So we were brought in by BBF as national contractors to conduct this study that ultimately will culminate with recommendations as to what the state should do next. What we've done so far is talk to a lot of people. We've talked to more than 85 stakeholders. We have more interviews even ongoing. And what we've started with is an effort to get a sense of what is the current status of the system, right? What are some of the strengths and weaknesses? What are some of the things that people aspire to? So that's really been our focus so far. And this month and in March, what we're doing is taking our initial findings, some of the major themes we've heard, and sharing them back with Vermont stakeholders to make sure that they resonate, right? To make sure we're accurately capturing what people are thinking. What's going to come next is that in April, we are going to share some recommendations of possible paths for moving forward. The number of paths is not limitless, right? There's only probably, I'd say less than half a dozen options that we're going to present. The reason we're doing this landscaping now is so that with each of the options we present, we can share some pros and cons of that option based on our understanding of the ground reality. And to be really clear, there will be major pros and major cons to every option we present. There is no slam dunk, it's obvious this is the best way to go, which is why it's important to feel like we have an honest sense of the landscape before we share those options. So that will be going on in April and May, and then we're going to produce an initial draft report in June that will be finalized by July. And again, we're hoping that all of you will remain engaged through that process. So we have shared, and it's available online, a summary document that collects voices from around the state, everything we heard. One of our goals, not every single detail we heard, but certainly the major themes of what we've collected, we wanted people to feel like they were heard, right? That when people shared their ideas, that we are listening to them and processing that. And also for people to hear each other, right? Everyone's got their own perspective on the system, and we've tried to place each perspective we heard into a larger context so that people can see both that their own views are reflected, but also that of their colleagues is reflected. We are not vouching for the truth of everything we heard. There were some consistent themes that we got from a lot of people. Where we heard the same thing from a lot of sources, that's meaningful. It doesn't mean that all of those people are right. So want to be really clear that we're not vouching for the truth of what we heard, just describing what was presented to us. Particularly, in general, want to be very sensitive to the idea that in these processes of talking about state level governance, there is a tendency for people to talk about what they see as the shortcomings of state government, and that can feel very personal for the people who fill those roles. In general, it's worth saying that when people have concerns about how state government is operating, it is about the systems and structures much more than the people. But those things are intertwined. And I just want to say that up front because it is definitely not our intention to put the folks who work in state government on the defensive. In many instances, those folks are struggling with some of the structural problems more than anyone else, right? So this is not meant to be a critique of the staff. It's not a performance review. It's a systems analysis, and very important to flag that at the outset. That having been said, in all of these, in every state that has wrestled with this issue, there is a dynamic between what is the right structure and that we think of as like a 10 to 20 year structure, and how do we navigate that with the people who actually fill these jobs right now, both of which are important and neither of which is 100% of the equation, and the relationship between those two things can be complicated. So again, we haven't solved that problem, and I'm not going to offer you any easy solutions today, but just wanted to name that dynamic, and happy to discuss it further if people want to. So again, the goal of this document that we circulated, which I will be summarizing in this PowerPoint, is just to sort of reflect back what we've been hearing, to collect additional feedback from stakeholders about what they see going on in the early childhood field in Vermont. Okay, so what are the major themes that we heard? First, I'm going to give you a brief topic summary so that you know what's coming. We're going to talk about state government capacity, local capacity, the dynamic between human services and education, children's integrated services, special education, collaborative structures, which includes BBF and its regional councils, and then data. Okay, state government capacity. One of the things that, and I'll talk about this more at the end in the analysis, but one of the things that folks reflected on is leadership capacity. And one of the questions we asked a lot of the folks we spoke to is, is there in Vermont a senior official who, in your view, has administrative authority over the early childhood system and is empowered to speak on its behalf? And by and large, the answer was no, right? I mean, the CDD probably comes as close as anybody, but CDD is not set up in the same way that some states have set up a commissioner level leader or a deputy commissioner within an agency who actually has line oversight of pre-K, childcare, often home visiting, and sometimes other functions as well, where they are really sort of seen as the leader of the system. In fact, one of the things we heard pretty consistently is that within both AHS and AOE, there is a divide between how the leaders think and how the line staff think, and that those two agencies also have struggled to coordinate so that there can be inconsistent visions coming from essentially four quadrants, right? The leadership and the line staff across both agencies. One of the things that we heard, and this is relatively typical in these projects, is there is a perception among private providers that AOE does not fully understand their context, right? Does not speak their language in the same way that AHS does. Again, that's relatively common for private providers to feel about state education agencies. We also heard that there are concerns about CDD from people in the field, that some of those relationships are not at their best point right this minute, and that one of the challenges for CDD has been that the proposal to essentially disperse its functions has put it in a bit of a holding pattern, especially while this process is going on, that it's a little harder for CDD to recruit and retain talent when its future is uncertain. So that one of the things that a lot of people in the field talked about is the practical impact of having these different approaches. That the fact that there are sort of two different oversight bodies, particularly in pre-K, has led to some inconsistency, and that for folks in the field, right, they're often getting different instructions from different agencies. We got a number of specific examples people gave of, like, AHS told me to do X, and then AOE told me to do negative X, and I just went with whichever one I thought was better for me, right? So that's a coordination issue that people identified. It's also worth noting that a number of folks felt that the staffing levels in both agencies was not adequate to meet the charges that have been put on those agencies. When it comes to local capacity, what we heard is that there's substantial variation across communities, that there are some communities that have really successful local collaboratives where different kinds of providers work well together, and that the school districts are actively involved. There are others where that's much more of a struggle. One of the things that, again, is sort of a tricky dynamic over time is, what is the right state role in supporting that work? There's a sense that there could be a state role in supporting it. People aren't 100% clear on exactly what that is, but there's a pretty strong belief that there is a need for coherent local systems, and that the state could play some role in helping that. One thing that people identified, again, going back to some of the dynamics in state government, is that AHS and AOE have different geographic boundaries for their regions, and that only adds a layer of complication when it comes to sort of navigating this work locally. Beyond the sort of standard interagency collaboration struggles, and again, this is not unique to Vermont, this is a challenge in almost every state you talk to, that one of the things that seems particularly pronounced in Vermont is sort of a divide between folks who focus on human services and education. Some people articulated that a little bit differently and talked about it as sort of private versus public, thinking about providers or school districts at the local level. There's also clearly some number of folks who approach early childhood from a public health viewpoint, which is a little different than either of those things. But there was a sense that there are sort of different norms, expectations, and practical realities for people who work in human services and in education, and that is a challenge at the local level, it's a challenge in state executive branch, and it's a challenge even in the legislature, where there are different camps between sort of the human services legislators and the education legislators who may have very different views about what the state's path should be going forward. There was a sense that one of the main points of interaction between those camps is the state pre-K program, and that the design challenges of that program may actually be making the tensions worse, right? And some of the legislators, we talked to took some ownership of that, and said basically that like the way pre-K was set up, the hope had been that it would lead to sort of good coordination at the local level and more collaboration, but that some of the design elements of that program have actually made it harder and created tension where it doesn't necessarily need to exist. So the redesign of pre-K is a little bit outside the scope of our project here, but authority for a redesigned pre-K program is well within our scope, and so that's one of the things to think about as this moves forward, is sort of what might that look like. Children's integrated services is something that's come up quite a bit, and we're going to be having some more conversations about that in the coming weeks. But it is a very innovative approach. It has run into the same problem that innovative approaches have run into in other states as well, which is that it is now big enough that there's a critical mass of providers involved, and it's got a meaningful constituency, but that it's not the entire system, and that can create an awkward fit both at the state and local level. It does represent a substantial administrative burden at the state level. That's by design, right? Like part of the goal there is to take the burden off of communities, off of families, and put it somewhere else. But that is a challenge, right? And there's also been some challenge with CIS of defining and measuring success. There are many people who perceive it to be successful, but that getting sort of firm data on that has been a bit of a challenge. With special education, one thing that we heard a fair bit is that this is an issue in rural communities where the school district is responsible for the special education services a child receives, but that many children receive childcare or other sort of whatever they're doing during the day is not within the boundaries of the school district. And there are very different views on how that should be handled, right? There are some folks who think that what that means is that school districts should be much more flexible about delivering services outside their own boundaries. There are other folks who believe that that is a reason to sort of double down on the infrastructure of school districts and make them a sort of more complete hub for those families. I would definitely say that, that we heard from multiple people expressing both of those viewpoints. Okay, collaborative structures. General appreciation for the idea of the State Advisory Council and for the infrastructure represented by BBF and its regional councils. And I will tell you from having, just as a sort of personal aside, from having worked with multiple states, that the level of investment and support in Vermont for these collaborative tables is really impressive, and could be an exemplar for other states. That having been said, there were some questions people raised about their impact, right? And that while there is a value to having these collaborative tables, the question of are they getting at complex problems in a deep way, right? One of the things that all of advisory councils struggle with is this report out theater, or are we really solving problems? and we heard some different views on that question. So something to think about going forward. One way or another, there will be a need for collaborative structures that cut across agencies. And so thinking about how they might adjust in any changing landscape is definitely something we want to keep on the radar screen. Data. So this is something that we've talked about with a number of folks, both inside and outside state government. There is a strong desire for improved data. There's not yet a consistent culture of data use, but there's definitely some promising building blocks that people are trying to build on. That is going to require better data infrastructure. And several people talked about some challenges in the past of sort of building better data systems at the state level and projects that haven't gone as planned. For data to be meaningful, it has to come, it has to be timely. There has to be capacity to analyze it. There is some capacity to do that, but that those folks tend to be overstretched. So the question of what does it look like to have data as really sort of the juice of managing the system on an ongoing basis. And I'll share some more thoughts on that in just a moment. All right, so that is what we heard from the field. I want to share a few analytic thoughts. And again, these are coming from the analytic team, not necessarily from stakeholders. The lack of unitary leadership is a big deal, right? And again, this is a challenge that makes it hard for everybody in the system, in both agencies and in the field, right? And that a number of states have realized that to have a coherent system requires a more coherent leadership structure at the state level, and that they see numerous benefits to having early childhood under one roof. It is, even if you agree with that premise, there then becomes the complex conversation of what roof is that? And that's part of what we're going to be talking about in April and May. But I want to flag for you that in our outsiders' view, many of the challenges of the system can be traced to the fact that leadership is dispersed, and that forcing folks into a collaborative, an attempt to collaborate when there's no line authority sort of making them do so, has not proved to be a winning formula in many states. One thing we heard relatively consistently from folks is that in Vermont, the culture of change can be a little challenging, right? That people are anxious about change, even when they are dissatisfied with the status quo and worried that somebody will be made worse off by it. One of the things that's important to emphasize in any governance change is that the outcomes are all speculative, right? Including the outcomes of the status quo. So we are going to be taking our best guesses, but that at some point, if Vermont is going to attempt to make improvement, it's going to have to just sort of hold its nose and jump into the pool, right? Maybe that's not a seasonal analogy, but and so one of the things to think about is how can we talk about the possibility of change in a way that sort of is seen as beneficial to as many people as possible, because clearly there's concern that that having any one group sacrifice for another's benefit is politically challenging. When it comes to one of the things, though, that I think states that have been successful at building cultures of change have done is put data at the heart of it, right? Because data, if done well, is a prompt for change, right? Like it tells you how things are really going. When you don't have consistent data, it can be very hard to understand what impacts the system is having. And states have often gotten trapped in this vicious cycle of data use where they can't produce, reliable data in a timely way. So they get used to making decisions without reliable and timely data. And that makes it harder to justify building the infrastructure necessary to produce reliable, timely data because no one's demanding it. So one of the things we're pushing a little bit is that in this moment, maybe it's time for a break and reset, right? Like, can Vermont put in place the infrastructure needed to produce reliable, timely data, start making decisions based on that, and have a management infrastructure that really relies on that for ongoing support of the system? It's worth noting also that the scope of this is a little fuzzy around the margins, right? Like everybody gets that we're talking about at least childcare and pre-K. That is an important part of the early childhood system. It's far from all of it, right? And so you look at home visiting, you look at special education, you look at a number of other services, and the question of how do those fit with this is something that, again, is a bit of an open question and something that folks have expressed some different views on. Most people try to think of it broadly that we've talked to, but again, that's not necessarily a universal view. The role of the state is really important here, because in Vermont, community level work is very important. And there is a sense that the state plays an important role, but it's not, there are limits to that role. And so finding the right balance between state and local governance is part of this. We may not answer that question fully, but we want to be sensitive to that dynamic and make recommendations for a state infrastructure that is capable of managing that dynamic on an ongoing basis. Worth flagging here that, in a complex system, someone bears the burden of that complexity. And in too many states, and probably in too many Vermont communities, it's the parents, right? And so when you're talking about parents of children birth to 5, many of whom, for certain programs are by definition low income, those folks have very limited bandwidth. And all of us on this call are on this call because we believe that the burden should be lifted off of those folks. But the question of what exactly does that look like? What capacity should sit at the local level? What capacity should sit at the state level? Again, these are complex questions on which reasonable people can differ, but that sorting that out is an important part of this project. It is also worth noting that there were some number of folks we talked to who expressed a healthy skepticism that changing how state government is structured is actually going to make that big a difference at the ground level. That skepticism is well taken. It's not necessarily accurate, right? Like there are states where I think state governance changes have made a real impact at the community level. But having that skepticism in mind is important because in many ways, when states look at their governance structures, how they go about it is almost as important as what structures they're putting in place. And that they should be clear on what kind of change they're trying to accomplish. And that if they're creating empowered leadership, they also have the capacity under that leadership to actually execute on whatever they're planning, and the capacity to support communities as well and playing that role. With regard to the divide between human services and education, again, there was a broad perception that there are those camps, a lot of people who wanted to operate differently, right, and get past that. And again, one of the things that some states have thought about is early childhood as its own category, right? In many states, when subsidized childcare was placed in a state agency, it was placed in a human services agency because that was the kind of agency that oversaw programs of that kind. And that in many states, when preschool was placed in an agency, it was placed in an education agency because it was seen as an educational service, and that politically, that's part of why it was created. That all made sense, but there are a number of states where that happened, and then over time, they came to think, well, early childhood is actually its own body of expertise and requires a governance structure where the expertise is not human services, it's not education, it's early childhood. And that it understands the dynamics of the field and is able to work with it in a way that is neither strictly human services nor education. It's a cocktail of both. Some states have done that by creating a standalone agency. Others have built that expertise within a larger agency, a human services agency or an education agency. There is no magical right answer. It's all contextual. But I would only commend to you the idea that thinking of that body of expertise and the potential for unifying where that expertise sits is something that, again, might be worth considering given Vermont's context. All right, that is a lot. I've talked a lot and very fast, but I'm going to stop there. And I'm actually going to maybe stop sharing my screen so that we can all see each other a little bit better. So hopefully, if folks have questions, comments, would love to hear them. But again, thanks for being part of this call and really appreciate your involvement in the process. I did not do the smart thing and like tag somebody in advance to like break the seal and be the first commenter. So I'm hoping someone will take the lead.
I'll take the lead. I'll be brave. This has been, I need to go back and read the report now. I will completely disclose that I was one of the people that did the smaller group conversations, which for anybody who hasn't, it was a great experience to be able to have that conversation back and forth. But I did just click the link so that I have the piece. I think the piece that really strikes me is the complexity and the depth of the research that you all have done, and how necessary that piece is to examining our processes in the state. And I just wanted to recognize that.
I appreciate your saying that. These are complex problems. And again, there is no magical right answer, right? And so what's going to happen in April and May is we're going to be discussing a lot of trade-offs. And part of what we're trying to do now is just set up what some of those trade-offs are and having an accurate understanding so that we're able to have that conversation productively. Recognizing that different people will have different viewpoints and that different people will weigh different factors differently. But again, that's really what we're hoping to be able to set up. Diane, your hand is up, I see.
You know, I second what Becca said. I really appreciate the depth of what was there and feel that it reflects some of my understandings as well. One question I did have is, in all of your conversations and in all of the reports that you looked at, spanning the decade of this work that goes back further, did you find that they matched, that there were areas that it matched, that all of that work, like the Blue Ribbon Commission, the think tank, all of that different work, did you see that linked in with people's responses? Did you see that there were areas of similarity and of potential moving forward, or what was that experience like?
Yeah, I think what people aspire to was pretty consistent, right? And in some ways, there was nothing in any of the reports that we read where we thought, oh, like that represents sort of a road not taken, right? Or a road that no one's interested in taking, right? Like there's some things that people identify that haven't been fully completed yet. So I wouldn't say we saw a lot of inconsistency between what the reports were talking about and what people were talking about today. But what we did see, and again, this is, very typical, is aspirations that were not yet achieved, right? And that people want, in the report articulated things they wanted that they haven't been able to accomplish yet. And so I think part of what we're trying to do in this process is honor that, right? Like, and honor all the things that people said they wanted, and try to be pragmatic about coming up with a roadmap toward achieving some of those things, with the recognition that, this is not going to solve all the problems for sure. But the hope is that it will put the state in a better position to solve some problems and to, in a more affirmative way, achieve the things that many of these reports have been talking about aspirationally. To that end, one thing, and then Cynthia, I see you've got your hand up, and we'll call on you in a second. One of the things that a number of states have articulated when they've made governance changes is the idea of having high-level advocacy for early childhood and having a commissioner level leader or near commissioner level leader who is empowered to sort of advocate for the field, including with the legislature. And I will tell you, and again, this is my personal experience, so I don't want to extrapolate it too much, although I've talked to other people who've had the same thing, is very early on in my consulting career, I did a project in Georgia, which was one of the first states to have its own early childhood agency. And the commissioner they had at the time was very politically savvy, right? Closely connected with the governor, had been around for a long time and knew how the game was played. And watching her operate, right, was magical is maybe too strong a term, but it was totally energizing, right? And that she would be, because the reality is that commissioners can make decisions and do advocacy in a way that's totally different than division managers or even assistant commissioners. And that there was a project she was working on where at some point she just called 3 other commissioners together and they sat around a table and they just hashed it all out, right? Having that kind of advocacy for early childhood, is part of why other states have gone the route of having more senior empowered leaders. And again, that is in no way a knock on the people who are occupying the current jobs in Vermont. Only to say that, having a setup where there is that kind of leadership structurally has been perceived by some states as making a difference and is seen by some states as necessary to accomplish all of the goals that they've articulated in their reports that are analogous to the ones Vermont has produced. So that may have been way more answer than you were bargaining for, but I just wanted to say that. Cynthia, I'm sorry you've been patient.
No problem. Thanks, Elliot. Thanks everyone for this body of work. My question really relates to sort of financing. And one of the things that I've been thinking about is often how federal funds come in and state funds are used have dictated or played a role in creating the structures that we currently have, and can be used, for both good and bad, I would say, in terms of change making. So I'm curious, in this body of work, where does funding and the funding streams and the structure of that funding fit into how we might think creatively? Would there be barriers that we would need to think about in creating a new structure or redesigning the early childhood system? And at what point then do we have that conversation about financing? And I see you smiling, Elliot. So
yeah. And Morgan may want to jump in and help here. I want to give a 2-part answer, one of which is sort of process oriented, and then get into sort of a philosophy of thinking about this. From a process standpoint, in fact, there is going to be a finance study that there's actually, I believe the RFP is now out. Yes, the RFP is now out for that. And so Vermont will be hiring expert consultants to come in and study its early childhood financing and make recommendations for what that should look like, which will be coordinated with our governance work, right? Like it will be different contractors, but that we are going to partner with them to help set them up to be successful. And they will be looking at, an analysis of, again, given what Vermont is trying to accomplish, how much is that going to cost? How might the financing be structured? So Morgan, anything more you want to say about that before I launch into a sort of, further answer?
Sure. So just to give you a sense of what's currently happening in that process, the Joint Fiscal Office has put out an RFP or a call for that proposal. And they do have a series of national contractors who are in the process of bidding for that proposal. And the goal is that alongside the systems analysis process, we will have this national contractor come in and say, here's the cost. Here's what it would cost you to build the system that the systems analysis says is this gold standard. So whatever Vermont chooses to do, or that range of options that Elliot's team provides for what we would want to build as the infrastructure for the early childhood system, the finance study will come in and say, here's what it costs. Here's what that system would cost. Here's how much it would cost to transform from what we have now to that system. And here are all the potential funding mechanisms or the ways you could think about funding it through, is that state, is it federal? What are all of those potential opportunities? So that then, our state can look at all of those options and say, okay, here are the pros and cons to every single option. And here's how we want to move forward based on what we know about both of those things. In the interim, BBF is working under the HRSA grant that we have, the Early Childhood Comprehensive Systems Grant, to build a baseline early childhood budget. And so I think many of you already know a part of our role in statute is to be aligning and integrating those budgets to say, here's what we know about all of the different funding sources and resources allocated to kids and families. It's a role we haven't been able to play and meet in the last 5 years. So this is for the first time in that amount of time, our next step in actually looking at all of those funding sources and trying to reduce duplication and align those efforts. And the hope is that we will have that baseline for the the national contractors who are coming in to do the finance study as some of that baseline work, alongside providing them with all of the documentation that's happening for the systems analysis. So the second those contractors are onboarded, they will also start attending the works in progress meetings for the systems analysis and being really involved.
So that is a process part of the answer. Cynthia, I want to talk a little bit more substantively too, and just sort of, and some of this I think is in the materials, but that the federal money is often more flexible than the way that states use it, right? And that particularly on the childcare side. And one of the things that we're encouraging the state to think about is in terms of functions more than funding streams, right? So you have multiple funding streams that all are supporting professional development, monitoring and oversight, right? And there's a number of functions that are consistent across funding streams that are now all sort of with their own separate infrastructure. And if you think about, and again, this doesn't happen automatically in a governance change, but one of the things that a governance change might allow you to think about differently is, okay, how are we using our childcare, pre-K, potentially even Head Start and home visiting and other funds? Like, how are we thinking about professional development holistically, monitoring and accountability holistically, and using each funding stream in service of a coordinated goal, rather than each funding stream having its own sort of distinct management, processes that operate in parallel? That is not something that you snap your fingers and make happen overnight, right? But that some of the states that have made changes in governance have done so specifically because they wanted to think about how their funding supports functions more than sort of have it be like, here, there's childcare here, and there's pre-K here, and there's Head Start here, and there's home visiting here, and there's special ed here. And again, that is its own body of work, but that changes in governance can set up a more effective process of approaching the funding that way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's exactly the nutshell I was hoping you would talk about cracking, because I think in Vermont, we have set up very complex funding mechanisms for early childhood. And it is in part why I think we have a fractured system. So really looking at function might help us untangle some of that web when we look at governance as well. Thanks,
Yeah,
I hope that's helpful.
No, that's the hope. And that having, again, sort of a more unified governance structure allows folks to look at it with the hope that they can actually make the decisions needed to implement a system like that. Some of that might be legislative, right? But again, like if you've got sort of an empowered centralized unit within the executive branch, that grouping can hopefully develop relationships with the legislature and help facilitate that conversation in a way that allows for those changes. It's also the case that in many states, much of the again, and I haven't done a full analysis in Vermont, so I don't want to speak to that, but that many of the complexities are administrative and can be addressed in the executive branch if the executive branch is set up to do that. Other thoughts and questions, and this has been, these questions are right on point, so glad to hear them. Pam.
Elliot, I just want to say first and foremost, it's really exciting to see this work advancing. And I'm really curious, particularly given Sacred Cow's political will and the dreams and visions that you're hearing reiterated that, I've seen in my experience in the early childhood system for years and years and years now. What do you think it's going to take based on your experience to create that hold your nose and jump into the pool idea that you were mentioning before? Because I think there's great desire to see change, as you pointed out, and to really make things better for children and families and create good outcomes. but there have been barriers, both real and imagined over time, and we really want to see it be different this time. So I'm curious about what your insights are based on your work with other states.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I think what, and I give BBF credit because they were the ones who sort of set up this process. Like, there are a lot of states where a process like this is sort of what ended up helping to break the dam a little bit, right? And getting as much stakeholder consensus as possible, not expecting it to be universally beloved, but at least sort of a well thought out plan. And then it really does take political leaders saying, yes, like, we're ready to do this, right? You cannot, I guess there's one example of a state that did this despite a governor being opposed. But it was a sort of unique circumstance, and over time the governors have come to embrace the change, but that the legislature basically sort of forced it down the governor's throat. That is not usually the model. Usually it comes from the governor and legislators have been part of a process that at the end they say, this has produced something that I am confident in enough to take the leap. And that without that political leadership, it's very hard. And that part of what a process like this does is give those folks the sort of tools they need to make that jump. And I will say, by the way, that like the active involvement of legislators in this process has been really energizing, right? Like that gives me hope that that will be there. It is not usually the case that processes like these come to the legislature with multiple plans that then get fought out in the legislature. It's usually like there is a plan that people are coalescing around and that the legislature either buys it or it doesn't, right? So that's the hope for this process, is that the recommendations will come out in July and that there will then be some time to sort of burn those in and socialize those such that come, this time next year, people are sort of ready to move on it and act. And I think that there is, I would say this, no one is sort of fully committed to, hey, we're going to make a change regardless of what this process produces. But there is a sense that the status quo isn't satisfactory. And so there's a sort of action imperative. And there's definitely a sense that, like, if we're able to produce something that people can largely coalesce around, that there's a desire to move forward. So, nothing is ever 100%, but I would say that there is reason to be optimistic that when the time comes, people can be there. We are at the time that on the agenda would have been the end, but Anna has given me the all clear to make sure there aren't any last questions before we wrap up this portion of the agenda. Diane.
Sorry, but I guess what I'm hoping for too, when we see the recommendations, is the understanding of what role we all are playing in it. So many of us are used to having to be in that kind of that pushing mode. And so wondering, what is the responsibility that gets really clearly defined for our legislature that has said we need to be doing this work, but also, moving beyond just the rhetoric. How do we get it into action, and how do we identify the key roles and players?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I will say it's probably a little outside our scope to have like the full mobilization action plan. But what we're hoping to do, right, is, in the few months starting with April, is play whatever role we can to build as much consensus as possible within the field for here is what the next step should look like. And through that, right, like if folks actually coalesce around something, which again, at this point, we're not 100% sure, that then everybody will have some role in working on that. And that I suspect that a number of folks in the advocacy community will have some much smarter thoughts than I would about who's supposed to do what. But I will say this, like, without speaking for the advocacy community, they've been very actively involved. I think they're ready to be actively involved, even more actively involved, in that if there is something resembling a consensus that there will be folks whose job it is to sort of push that. But my role as outside consultant is a little bit different.
And Elliot, if I can build on that a little bit, I think that what everyone on this call needs to understand is that as a part of the Building Bright Futures Network and a VCAP committee, a part of our role is accountability for the early childhood system, right? It is maintaining momentum on how we truly do meet the vision outlined in Vermont's Early Childhood Action Plan, right? And so I think that what I would like you to all realize is it's all of our job to make sure that we are making this progress for the system and making sure that we are taking the recommendations and putting them into action. And this body of work is separate from the State Advisory Council's recommendations, but it will be our responsibility as a network and as a State Advisory Council to review those recommendations and then make our own for how to move this work forward, right? And again, continually hold each other, but also the legislature, the governor, the administration, and all of our partners accountable to the vision that we've outlined.
All right. Any final thoughts anyone else wants to share? If not, I'll just say, again, if there are comments that people want to share individually, please do so. There's a forum to do so anonymously. I know Morgan and Anna have my email address, so if you don't already, many of you do, please reach out directly, and we will be looking forward to continued conversation in the months ahead. We have made headway, but there's still a long way to go, and really appreciate everyone's active engagement. That is, a critical part of it too. So really glad to see everyone here today, and looking forward to continuing the conversation in the future.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Elliot. And thank you all for your thoughts and feedback this morning. We very much appreciate it. I'm going to briefly just end by sharing a final slide with you all. And this is particularly relevant for folks who are regular participants of COAT, but everyone is certainly welcome to stay on it and give us feedback on this. As a reminder, our last meeting, we did a brief Jamboard exercise and kind of discussed the feedback folks have on the committee's process to date and what we can do to improve this committee and other committees to ensure that you all are seeing your work represented within the BBF network more broadly and in really within the goals of this committee. Within that, we did a little brainstorming about what agenda items folks would like to see in the coming months and what kind of topic areas COAT hasn't necessarily delved into in depth recently. And here I've just kind of listed the top things that came to mind or rose to the top for folks. So I would love, with our couple of minutes left, if folks could take a look at this list and in the chat, or you're welcome to unmute as well if you'd like to expand on any of these ideas. But if in the chat, you could identify kind of the top 2 or 3 of this list that you would like to see COAT focus on in the next couple of meetings, that would be really helpful. I will just say that our next meeting, our March meeting, we're planning on focusing on family partnership and family engagement work, specifically kind of related to our HRSA grant that Morgan talked a little bit about in the beginning, but more broadly as well. So that is kind of the next thing on our agenda, but would love if folks could put in the chat what other topics they would like to see us focus on.
And as you're all doing that, I just want to make sure that folks know that Monday's State Advisory Council meeting from 1:30 to 3 o'clock, so Monday the 28th, it is a much bigger meeting. We anticipate a lot more folks in attendance. We will be having a discussion about diversifying engagement in the Building Bright Futures Network. We've also invited our advocacy partners to come and speak about what's going on in the legislative session and what people should be paying attention to related to early childhood. And we have leadership from the Agency of Human Services, specifically Dr. Levine and Miranda Gray, as well as Kendall Smith from the governor's office and Dan French from the Agency of Education, coming to speak about agency-wide priorities. And then we'll have a discussion after the fact with the board, with the State Advisory Council on early childhood priorities, both urgent and longstanding gaps that we need to be discussing.
That's great. Thank you, Morgan, for that reminder. And thank you all for your thoughts in the chat. These are really helpful. We have a couple minutes left if anyone wants to kind of expand on what they put in the chat or anything else. But otherwise, we will let you all go on time.
Anna, this is Cynthia. Can I just say super quickly, from work that we're doing with a variety of advocacy and groups working in the legislature, and I know some of my team members are on this call as well, I just want to bring up sort of this, and I know that BBF and these committees walk a line with advocacy, but I just want to say, you know, we're hearing some exhaustion from legislators, kind of not fully understanding or embracing the concept that people are still really, really hurting despite the millions of dollars that are going out the door. And I don't really know what to do with that other than, you know, how do we use this grassroots, you know, public-private organization to help ensure that our legislators continue to hear that our families are really struggling, and we can't stop, right? We can't stop supporting them. We have to continue to invest in them. And yes, there are millions of dollars coming in, but you know, this pandemic has just wreaked havoc. And so I don't know. I've just been noodling on, you know, is there something that we could do as a collective body that supports our legislators, right? They're tired too, but helps keep an appropriate amount of pressure on them to say, we have to continue to support them. And I don't know what else to do other than raise that issue. So I'm sorry to do that at the very end, but I appreciate the opportunity to just say it.
Cynthia, I really appreciate you bringing that to this group. And I think it's something that we continually talk about at Building Bright Futures. And I just want to make a couple of statements about the role, right? So the way that we describe Building Bright Futures, especially the State Advisory Council's role, is that we don't advocate on behalf of any one specific bill or proposal, but we do advocate on behalf of the entire early childhood system, right? Our State Advisory Council recommendations are not neutral. They are very much so targeted towards the areas of need. And as an entire network, one of our responsibilities is to elevate the voice of families and communities and be communicating that to the legislature and the administration and the governor's office specifically to say, here's what you need to know is happening urgently in the field. And here's some guidance for how to think about addressing that. So I think that one of the things that we can do better at BBF in terms of the team that is supporting the entire network is make sure that you all know where those opportunities are to actually provide direct feedback and how exactly it's being elevated up. So one of those examples is that on a weekly basis, we are elevating urgent priorities and considerations from the field to the entire administration and anyone who is making decisions about how to support kids and families through a feedback form. So as we're hearing in every one of our meetings, whether it's a regional council meeting or any of our VCAP meetings, whoever is in that virtual room on the BBF staff, we're documenting those questions and concerns and including them in a format that goes directly to the governor's office and all of the members on ECICT, the Early Childhood Interagency Coordinating Team, which includes DMH, VDH, right? All of our different agencies, departments, and divisions that are supporting kids and families. So we're elevating it in that way. But in addition, we are consistently meeting with our legislators to say, don't forget what you're hearing from the field right now. in addition to kind of longer standing priorities. So anything, and if folks have feedback for BBF specifically on how to do that well, how to do it in a more public or visible way so that folks know how to give that feedback and how it's being elevated, we would love your feedback on how to do that, well.
Wonderful. Thank you, Morgan, for that. And thank you, Cynthia, for the question. I think that was a great kind of way to ground us in the work and conclude the meeting. So if no one else has any pressing thoughts, I think we'll end it there. And thank you so much all for your time. And thank you, Elliot, for the presentation and update on the systems analysis.
Great to see you all this morning.
Have a great day.